The town of Lansbury was nothing short of picturesque, a small village nestled between thick forests. The place had an ethereal calm, one that could almost deceive the outsider into thinking nothing ever went wrong here. The tall, sweeping hills, lined with patches of dense trees, formed the perfect backdrop. From every corner of Lansbury, there was a sense of nostalgia in the air. Every stone house, every crooked fence, and even the narrow cobbled streets seemed to belong to another era, simpler time. But despite its peaceful facade, Lansbury was hiding something, a truth too dark to speak aloud. Buried beneath layers of silence and carefully kept secrets, at the edge of town stood the Riverton estate, an old mansion that had been in the family for generations. The house was a sprawling property, surrounded by immaculate gardens and trimmed hedges that gave the appearance of a home where everything was in order. Yet, inside the grand walls of the estate, it was a different story. Behind closed doors, there were no warm dinners by the hearth, no gentle laughter to fill the rooms. Instead, there was only the palpable tension that clung to the walls like dust, waiting to suffocate anyone who dared to enter. Sophie Riverton, the current lady of the house, had inherited her place through marriage to Edward Riverton. When Sophie arrived at the estate 5 years ago, she was welcomed as the grieving widow of the late Edward. She appeared soft-spoken, graceful, and perfect in every way. Her arrival had been seen as a fresh start for the Riverton family, and for a while, it was. But that was the illusion everyone lived under. In truth, Sophie was only a part of the story that was yet to unfold, a story that would soon be soaked in blood and deceit. Sophie had always felt an invisible wall between herself and Edward's son, Marcus, a young man now in his mid. The relationship between them had started quietly enough, with Sophie taking on the role of a stepmother after Edward's death. At first, their interactions had been few, their words polite and measured. Sophie had tried her best to be kind, but there was something about Marcus's eyes, something deep and unreadable, that made her feel uneasy. She could not place it, but she knew that something inside him had shifted after his father's death. Marcus was different now, more brooding, more distant. The boy who had once been a child seeking guidance had transformed into a young man who seemed to distrust everyone around him, including Sophie. His presence in the house felt almost suffocating. The rooms felt colder when he was around. Their shared silences were a constant reminder that they lived in the same house, but belonged to different worlds. Over time, Sophie couldn't help but notice how the air shifted when Marcus was near. It was as if something unspoken passed between them, like an invisible thread drawing them closer in ways they both should have avoided. Sophie found herself thinking of him more often, her thoughts drifting to him when she was alone. Even when she knew she should never entertain such feelings, she fought it, of course, suppressing the urge with all her might. But what was it that drew her to him, made her linger in his presence longer than she should? It was during one of these moments of tension that Sophie realized something. The attraction she felt toward Marcus wasn't just a physical one. No, there was something more complex at play. It was as if Marcus represented everything she had been missing in her marriage to Edward. Edward had been kind, but he had never truly seen her. He had never truly understood her loneliness, her desires, her needs. With Marcus, however, there was an intensity, a rawness that was impossible to ignore. One evening, as they sat in the drawing room, Sophie felt the heaviness in the air. It was late, and the fire was dying in the hearth. The room had become unbearably quiet, save for the faint rustling of the trees outside the windows. Sophie had poured herself a glass of wine, the liquid sloshing slightly as she tried to steady her hand. She knew that Marcus was watching her, even though she pretended not to notice. When she finally met his gaze, she was caught off guard by the intensity in his eyes. They were full of something unspoken, something that made her blood run cold, yet strangely warm at the same time. "Are you all right?" Marcus asked, his voice low and almost calm. Sophie nodded, but she couldn't bring herself to say anything more. The words felt heavy in her mouth. She wanted to speak, to explain the turmoil she had been feeling for the past few months, but she couldn't. Instead, she sat there, staring into the fire, letting the silence stretch between them. "What's really going on, Sophie?" Marcus's voice broke the quiet. There was no accusation in his tone, but the question lingered in the air like a challenge. "I'm fine," Sophie replied, her voice faltering slightly. She turned away, her eyes focusing on the fire, desperate to avoid his gaze. But Marcus wasn't finished. "You don't seem fine. I can see it in your eyes. You don't hide it as well as you think." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. Her hands gripped the glass tightly as she struggled to maintain her composure. For a moment, the world around her felt as if it had paused, the very air thick with the weight of his words. "You're mistaken," she managed to say, though her voice trembled slightly. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his gaze not leaving hers. "Am I?" he asked quietly. "You're lonely, aren't you, Sophie? And you're afraid of what you might be feeling, because you know it's wrong. But deep down, you're not so sure, are you?" Sophie stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. Her mind was spinning. How could he know? How could he say those things with such certainty? But she couldn't back down now, not after what had already been said. "I think you should leave," Sophie said, her voice cold and firm. though it trembled with an underlying emotion that even she couldn't place. Marcus stood, but he didn't move toward the door. Instead, he crossed the room slowly, deliberately. You don't want me to leave, Sophie. You've never wanted me to leave. In that moment, Sophie knew, deep down, that everything was about to change. There was no turning back from what had already begun. Her heart raced, but she stood still, unable to move. She could feel the tension rising between them, thick and suffocating, like a storm about to break. Marcus, she whispered, her voice barely audible, please. But it was too late. The distance between them had already closed, and neither of them was prepared for what would happen next.